So I'm Chris Zimmerman, Vice President for Economic Development at Smart Growth America. And I'm going to talk about some of the details, the major findings of this new report called Zoned In. And then I'm going to give some examples from one of the places that are included as a case study in the report. So this is the report, Zoned In, Economic Benefits and Shared Prosperity with Form-Based Codes. It was a research project that we started with a couple of different particular interest questions we wanted to address. The first one, most basic, was what's the impact of form-based codes in terms of promoting development? Basically, is a form-based code an economic development tool? To put it simply, did the implementation of a form-based code result in new development? Is it used? The second set of questions concern equity issues. If a form-based code is implemented, are there adverse effects for existing residents, in particular low-income and minority households? To put it another way, did the implementation of a form-based code result in displacement of existing residents? So those are basically our study questions. Now, to do that, we face some particular data challenges from the fact that the form-based codes haven't been around that long. And so if you want to look for, period over time, you have to find places where they've been in place long enough to see if they've had an impact on, development and so on. And many of the form-based codes that are in place now are relatively new. So, we had a fairly limited set we could look at, but we wanted something where we could, see some different circumstances. And we were able to identify a number of them that had been kind of in place long enough, which is to say, more than a decade. But we also needed a basis for comparing one code to another. And, how do we compare the land that's been subject to form-based code with something that isn't? In other words, how do we know what effect it had? So the way we approached this study was as a yoke comparison between the areas in which form-based codes were implemented and kind of a comparison or control that was in nearby similar circumstances, would have faced the same kind of economic conditions, but didn't have the form-based code applied to it. And by looking at that, we could get a better sense of the impact of the code itself on the area that was involved. And having identified those, we looked at trends in land values, tax revenues, rents, demographics, those sorts of things, and conducted a quantitative analysis using a difference in difference approach to see over time how each of the pairs performed. We also did a qualitative analysis interviewing public and private stakeholders in each of the places. So as I said, we identified 4 places, and again, we wanted to get a sense, kind of broadly. So these are 4 places in different parts of the country: one in Virginia, one in Ohio, one in Texas, and one in Florida. And what we found, which, you can of course read all the details in the report, but basically we found that the places with form-based codes generally performed as well or better than the comparable areas with conventional zoning. In terms of development, the construction activity was higher, especially in terms of multifamily development, average of 154% versus 115% over that time. In other words, both were growing, but the form-based codes area grew more. They generated more in tax revenue for local governments. The number of residents in the form-based code areas grew faster than in the comparison area. And on the qualitative side, real estate developers touted the increased flexibility and predictability of the process in places where the form-based codes had been put into effect. So it seems that they were doing the things they were intended to do in terms of, at least in development terms. On the equity side, again, we had this question of, so what's the effect on existing residents? And what we found in these 4 cases was that there was no statistically significant change, in particular in the racial makeup of areas with form-based codes. The average rent in those places grew actually at a slower pace in the form-based codes area than in the comparison areas. And stakeholders across the jurisdictions indicated that they liked the quality of life improvements, the greater walkability, access to services, and those things that were coming as a result of the form-based code. Those are the general results. Again, you can see the details, the methodology, and the actual data if you look at the report itself. I'm going to talk about one of the 4 case studies, and you can hear another account from one of the other ones. I'm going to talk about the Arlington, Virginia example because I was in the government at that time as a member of the county board over the period that we did this. And I want to tell you about our experience. Columbia Pike in Arlington is a place that, as you can kind of sense from the picture, 20 years ago was a sort of typical suburban strip, very much car oriented, an arterial focused on moving traffic from one end to the other along its way, lots of curb, interruptions, curb cuts, parking lots and that sort of thing. Again, a familiar situation all across America. And people here wanted to be more of a main street that served the surrounding neighborhoods. They wanted a different pattern of development. And it was, a significant stretch in our community with about a fifth of the county's population in the area on either side of it to the north and south. And particularly an area with a large number of low and moderate income households. Almost half of the kind of affordable housing that is affordable, mostly market rate housing, but affordable to people at or below 60% area median income was in this corridor. So that was very significant as well. It's a very diverse area, immigrant population from countries on the order of 90, 100 different countries speaking that many different languages. So it was very critical both to try to transform this built environment, but also to ensure that there was a place for all the people who live here to continue to live here as the improvements are made. So generally speaking, after a couple of decades of this, it does seem to be working. From east to west, we've gotten new developments come in based on this code, and there are more in the pipeline. Right through two recessions, really, we've had continued construction with more commercial, more residential, more committed residential, that is to say, housing units that are committed to be affordable to folks at lower and moderate incomes, and other space too, as well as a significant increase in retail space. So I'm just going to run through some examples here. This is a map of the corridor from east on the right to west on the left. And these are areas in which all along here, the code has been applied. And this particular diagram shows the development status as of about a year or so ago. As I said, there's more in the pipeline. So we'll start at the east end. And this is actually one of the very first examples. The picture you see is of a grocery store that had been closed and sat there for a bit. The site, besides the box for the grocery store, was mostly parking lot, as you can see a little off on the left here in the picture. I should note that the people here have shown, this is a picture that was done for our initial charrette back in 2002, and these folks here are photoshopped. They're not actually there because we didn't really have many pedestrians at the time. But the building that then opened up under the code around 2010 shows retail on the ground floor, 5 stories of apartments. And with this, we actually got real pedestrians. We don't have to Photoshop them into pictures anymore. Going a little bit farther west, right adjacent to that site was another kind of strip shopping center with a grocery store, mostly parking lot, as these places would be. Under the code, we got a new development that included a new grocery store, which is in the building here to the right, and additional retail, and multiple stories of housing, and a big public amenity in the form of a square. So just to give you an idea, looking at it from above, first slide I showed you is over here. This was that old Safeway that was closed. This is the parking area. This was the other grocery store, and there was a drugstore and some strip here, and basically a lot of asphalt, as you can see. That was in 2007. If you look at it today, this is the first building I showed you, and this is the second. And over here we have the square, kind of a square. And the plan will provide for essentially the same kind of development going in over here and expanding the square over time. And that's the square, which is a lively place with a fountain, and runs in the summertime, and a lot of different events. This is the backside of what used to be there when it was the old strip shopping center, facing the community, facing single family houses on the other side. This is what it's like today. which of course is much more residential environment. Moving farther west, this is one of the first kind of major intersection west of there. We had an old set of storefronts that people liked, and in the code we incorporated provisions to maintain that, but then to be able to build with it. And we got this project that again has residential units over top, but also not only the retail in front here, but also retail incorporated here, wrapping around the other side. I should also say we also got public parking as part of it, which helps to support other development, which now doesn't have to provide its own parking. Here's the site. This is that building you just saw. It's over here on the left. The Pike is up here. This is the cross street. And just a few years ago, you would have seen this. This is from 2009, which was basically an empty lot. And then we got this. This is what's gone in its place. This apartment building here with retail on the ground floor, and you can see it tapers down to the neighborhood, and we got new sidewalks and street trees as a result. That's the place there. Getting to the next major intersection, we had a big site occupied for many years by a car dealership. So low and a big site occupying space, occupying a very big site for a single use that obviously is car oriented. And now we have a building that has, again, retail at the ground floor, residential over it. I'm not showing what's in back, but there's also a townhouse, set of townhouses that then transition into the single family neighborhood. And just off to the right here, you'll see another building that is the next one I'll talk about, which again, just going farther along down the pike, we had a church, which mostly had, of course, parking lot occupying a large part of the space. The church decided they wanted to do something. They needed to do something about their church building and infrastructure, and they wanted to address housing needs. And so they got together with a nonprofit housing provider and developed a plan under the form-based code to transform this and create a building that has all committed affordable housing, and retail on the ground floor and space for the church and so on. And this opened about, I guess it's 2 years ago now when they first opened, and underground parking to serve it all. And again, going farther was still, again, another old shopping center with a grocery store that was really beginning to show its age, and a lot of surface parking, because that's what you had along the street. And as of 2 years ago, when this project was completed, we had new grocery store in here, other retail along the ground floor, and much more housing, and a public plaza that was also, again, part of the design within the form-based code. Now we're going to the western end of the pike, and we had this area that had this off-center intersection, which was a real hazard by itself for pedestrians. And of course, as you can see, again, parking lots between the sidewalk and the buildings, low buildings basically. And up over here in particular, this is mostly parking lot and what had been a fast food restaurant at one time there. The county had to work to realign this street. That was part of it, but form-based code did the rest of the work. So this is the realigned street, and this is the new building on what had been parking lot and fast food restaurant. Again, ground floor retail with residents over it. And these are real pedestrians, folks who were there when I took this picture in October of 2019, just after the building was completed. And you can see it's already becoming a much more comfortable area for people who live nearby and who walk or ride bike. And then toward the very west, we had, yes, one more abandoned grocery store closed back in the 90s. And there was a building back here and a big surface parking lot. And the county took it over and turned this into a temporary community center, but always planned to have a more long-term approach. And under the form-based code, developed this building, this is a county-run community center. There actually is a retail space right here. It's run by a nonprofit bike shop right now. But there's a gym over here, and there's lots of activities all throughout this building. But the backside of the site gave us the opportunity to address some of the affordable housing needs. And so this building, which is behind it, was developed with a nonprofit affordable housing provider to provide 122 units of committed affordable housing, including a variety of different sizes of units, and serving some specific needs. And then all the way on the west, we had This was one of the first sites actually that got addressed back again in 2002. There's a parking lot and a little building that had a couple stories of office and some retail. As you can see at this end, we have tall buildings all around it. The folks who lived in this building on the left, which was a condo, essentially said, why not do something as tall as their building, because they wanted to see the site redeveloped. And so this was one of the first ones built. It's over 10 years old now, which again had retail on the ground floor and residential above it. Eventually, the parking lot over here can transform as well, again, under this plan. And then on the other side of the street from that was a little gas station that closed. And it occupied a corner that, you've seen what gas stations tend to look like in suburban roads. And you have, of course, curb cuts on both sides and not much sidewalk to speak of. As a result of development of the code, again, a nonprofit housing provider was able to obtain the site and submitted and got approval for a building under the code, which has, again, ground floor retail, 5 stories of apartments, which are committed to be affordable. And as you see, we get good public infrastructure as a result to support the walkable nature that we're trying to get under this code. And finally, this one I need to take pictures of. These are renderings, but this project is actually complete in place, which was a case of a parking lot being turned into an apartment building. It was a parking lot for a community that had committed affordable housing run by, again, a nonprofit. And they submitted a proposal under the plan that allowed for increased density to put here to create more committed affordable housing. So this is the condo I showed in the first place, fairly high value. There's other high value housing in the area, but there is now a fair amount of committed affordable housing also available, again, using the form-based code. As I said, it seems to be working. It happens that the county commissioned a study on economic development, looking at particularly the retail side of things. This is a picture of that Penrose Square I showed you in the beginning. And they concluded that essentially it was transitioning from autofocus to walkable development, as you can see. And specifically that there was a tremendous increase in retail available as a result of development under the code. So again, on the whole, very successful, I would say, and I do live here myself after more than a decade of development, going on 2 decades under this new code. It does seem to be transforming into a walkable place. It still is a diverse community that has been adding committed affordable housing to make it possible for people of low and moderate income to continue to call this their home. And I think it's an example of how you can do equitable development and create a better environment for everyone who lives there. Again, there's details in the report about the specific comparisons that were made analyzing this, as you will see with the other 3 communities as well. Thanks very much. If you would like more information or if I can help you in any way, feel free to contact me.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks for handling the introduction in my absence and for that excellent presentation. As Chris may have mentioned, there were 4 jurisdictions that we studied zoned in. One of them was Arlington County, Virginia, where Columbia Pike was compared with a similar corridor called Lee Highway that does not have a form-based code. The other 3 case studies were 2 different neighborhoods in Cincinnati, Ohio, and also 2 downtowns in Palm Beach, Florida. And then the 4th one was looking at 2 different sites, 2 different neighborhoods, very different neighborhoods in Fort Worth, Texas. The first one being a large-scale planned, mixed-use planned community called Alliance, Texas, and that does not have a form-based code. And the other is a downtown adjacent neighborhood called the Near South Side. Today we have Mike Brennan, who's president of Near South Side, Inc., which is the bid in Near South Side, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the impact of a form-based code in Near South Side, Fort Worth. So Mike, I think you're going to put up a couple of your slides. Is that right?
Yes, in fact, I thought I was already sharing.
There, now we,
Can you see them?
yep,
Can you see it in full screen now?
no.
Okay, all right, that's interesting. Okay, so what I'll do is, let me see, I guess I'll just have to stay within this view, but everybody can see those okay?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, okay, all right, well, it's an honor to be here, honor to be included in the Zoned In report, but also just to be part of this panel here as you're presenting this year's Driehaus Awards winner, and congratulations to Tim and Michael and the team in South Bend. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Near South Side. We've had a form-based code in place since January of 2008, and this photo that I'm showing here flashes back many more decades than that, back to actually 1939. But in this photo, you can see all of those fundamental urban design principles were really at the foundation of our district's original development. So you had buildings oriented to the sidewalk, you had complete streets that were designed to accommodate vehicles. You can see that originally they were designed to accommodate streetcars, and this photo is actually very telling in that in the foreground here, you can see that those streetcar tracks had already been torn out. So 1939, that was when things were transitioning for the district, and this model of mixed-use development, pedestrian-oriented development, soon was struggling against all of the forces that we know so well that affected our central cities across the country. So fast forward to the 1980s, 90s, and into the 2000s, and the development regulations, and of course just the development market was much more favorable to what you see on this screen here. So our previous zoning allowed this, and in many cases required this type of development by segregating land uses, mandating front yard setbacks, and so forth, all of those typical conditions. This project was actually under construction as we were putting together our form-based code. So this was sort of the poster child for what we would expect if things were to proceed without an update to our development standards. Fortunately, we had been testing through some targeted areas, some updates to our development standards prior to the adoption of the form-based code. So we had a mixed-use zoning classification that was tested along Magnolia Avenue, which I'll tell you more about. And so that the complaints that we had heard from developers who were focused on medical clinics that were saying this is the only way that we can do medical clinics, we soon had a counter balance to that argument with this different type of design that was oriented to the street, but still the same type of use. We then saw another early win with a mixed use development, whereas for so many decades, combining ground floor commercial uses with residential uses on the upper floors, as had been typical along our primary mixed use streets early in the century, it was no longer allowed. We had a pioneering physician that was willing to test the model in an area that we had zoned for mixed use, and saw that this was very successful. And this was became an unexpected trend as we saw the word spread among physicians, and we had a lot of clinics that were developed based on that mixed use model. If you look at our overall area, we're just south of downtown. This is roughly the boundary of the form-based code. This is a diagrammatic map showing that we are a combination of multiple mixed-use urban village type of zones combined with a couple of larger campus-oriented medical districts that are still connected to the urban village areas through this street grid that largely remains intact from the district's original development. And so we had to have a code that balanced all of the development conditions that you find within our district. This is the map of the boundary of the ultimate district that was adopted back in early 2008. You'll see a telling carve out here with one of the medical campuses that we really just, we negotiated forever and couldn't bring them on board, but all of the other 5 major medical campuses are included within our code. We were an early winner of the Driehaus Award, very early, in my opinion, back in 2008. And I think that was largely because it was such a unique context. It was obviously a major effort to get the code adopted. It was an in-house effort that I led soon after coming on board here at Near Southside Inc. And I'm glad to say that things have played out to where I think the built conditions are worthy of that recognition. Just a couple photos to tell the story of the evolution of the district. This is Magnolia Avenue back in the 90s. This is Magnolia Avenue today, recognized by APA as a great place in America. Those conditions of great historic buildings, a street reconfigured to be a complete street that is suitable for all users. Same ingredients applied to South Main Street. This was the conditions before we worked with private developers in the city to reconstruct the street and bring these buildings back. Obviously, the form-based code is much more focused on new construction. And so I'll show you some examples of the different project types that we have seen. And this is just a quick selection. So pay attention to the building here. I was happy to see that there was a photo shoot last week filming a commercial in front of this building, which was recently constructed, ground floor, small scale retail for entrepreneurs that really grew out of the neighborhood, with some high priced condominiums on the upper floor. So this is on Magnolia, kind of the showcase street, but really an expansion of that mixed use model that was pioneered by the doctors. The large scale multifamily folks, like you saw in Columbia Pike, they've discovered the near south side, but our code requires that engagement between those ground floor units and the roadside, and our form-based code requires the trees and the lights and all of the amenities there to create a nice public realm adjacent to that. The large scale multifamily that has really landed here. And so I'll talk more about how a lesson learned is to anticipate full build out based on the potential that the zoning allows. Proud to say that the institutional users have also built new buildings that are fully compliant with the code. And so that carve out that we saw from one of those hospitals, we're seeing that other hospitals have been able to really expand and prosper within the rules of the code. We've got an assortment of housing types that are being delivered. So you've got the mixed use model here next to some for sale townhouses, the small scale infill projects that were really that was the basis for the district's original development. We're seeing those just small infill projects and really pushing the envelope on architectural style. We see that with a lot of new projects. You see this Blue Blade Hotel here that's getting a lot of attention, recently constructed. And then you also see, just as important, the national chains adapting to our code and presenting, in this case, a CVS that really responds well to the street condition. So quick lessons learned. We did our code in-house, and it was a 2 square mile area with 1,500 acres, thousands of property owners. It was a council initiated rezoning, but we had to have dozens and dozens of meetings to convince folks, to walk them through all of the details of the code, but also convince them that this was going to be good. On the economic side as well as the quality of life side. And you can see on this graph just the rapid increase in property values that we've seen. I mentioned that we should always anticipate a market at its full potential, even though it didn't seem possible that we were going to realize all of the potential of our T4 and T5 zones. But once that zoning is in place, at least in Fort Worth, Texas, down zoning is not a real possibility, at least with our city council. So anticipate that if you have a zone that allows 4 to 5 stories and it's in an area that traditionally has been 2 to 3 stories, if you don't want 4 to 5 stories, then consider the T3 classification for those areas. It was good to see in the zoned in report that those myths about rapid increases in in costs and lack of affordability. That's not a direct correlation with form-based codes. We recommend and have pursued complementary efforts to just go out of our way to support affordable housing, particularly tax credit projects, by helping them navigate all that they have to navigate to get built, and also fostering entrepreneurship, often working hand in hand with developers and playing matchmaker between some of the entrepreneurs that grow out of our neighborhood and the spaces that are being delivered in these new projects. And then finally, just embracing architectural diversity. I think we're in a period now where the architectural community is very diverse in its outlook as to what building materials should be used and what context sensitive design is, and we do not dictate architectural style, and we've really just seen that there is no singular architectural approach that's a good match for our district, and we're embracing that architectural diversity. So really appreciate the opportunity to share with you today, and I'll be here for Q&A if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was a great presentation, and you stayed within the time frame pretty much. But mostly, thank you for those excellent lessons learned. I think Fort Worth is an interesting example of a community that really has embraced form-based codes. While you don't have, the city does not have a citywide code, form-based code, you have, I think now 6 or 7 areas that have form-based codes. So I think it's something that the community understands and is really understanding the economic impact. And I appreciate your focusing on that as well. I wanted to also we can take just a couple of questions before we switch gears and move into the discussion of the Driehaus Award. So I know, Jamie, is there 1 or 2 questions that have come in on the chat that you think would be of interest to everybody on the phone?
Absolutely. So the first question would be whether any of the jurisdictions have examined the impact of form-based code implementation on increased walking and pedestrian activity.
Chris, have you looked at that in Columbia Pike? We can't hear you. I don't know if you're.
Sorry, I forgot I was muted. So I was saying that I look at it almost every day as a resident of the area. And I would say casual empiricism suggests we have a whole lot more people out there walking and biking and so on than we ever did before. And I've lived along this route myself for about 40 years now. And I remember when I would go out there, when I didn't have a car, trying to find, a place to eat, which there weren't that many of, and there was no one else walking, along the street because it wasn't a great walking environment. And in the last 10 years, especially, we've seen, tremendous increase. I think this does call for formal study, and I would say, Marta, that's one of the next research projects I'd like to do. So, anybody is interested, I'd like to see that done formally.
Well, and there has been some research done, I know, at the University of Chicago on physical activity in form-based codes and the increase, looking really broadly. And Chris, I think it's just as a data point, when you showed your before pictures, you mentioned that the pedestrians in the photo had been photoshopped in. I'm going to assume that in your after pictures that those people on the street were in fact
all real people, all for real.
Great. Thank you. Mike, walkability, more people on the street now than before?
Absolutely. I mean, it's just a tremendous increase, and really the most rewarding aspect of the type of development that's been built under the code, because the vision that was being discussed back in the day when we were saying, hey, do we want a future that embraces these same urban design principles that originally, shaped the district, or do we want to have the car-oriented streets with the fast food places and the convenience stores? And everybody bought into the former, and we would talk about how this would be a much more walkable environment and people would take advantage of that. And that's exactly how it's played out. And it's really gone hand in hand with the street design efforts of bike lanes, bike network, bike share system, all of these other steps, of course, that go hand in hand on the public side with the private investment.
Great, great. And I appreciated your comment about housing affordability. And while form-based codes do not, in fact, cause gentrification or cause displacement, I think it's also important, the point you made, that a local government, as they adopt a form-based code, which does, we've discovered, not only make places more appealing and more walkable, but more economically viable, that unless the locality anticipates that this place is more desirable and therefore the natural tendency could be for rents, both commercial and residential, to go up, that if a locality is proactive and adopts housing affordability programs and initiatives, as you did in your South Side, and as I know Arlington County did along Columbia Pike, that there is a possibility of displacement, but there are also things that you can anticipate and put in place that will mitigate that displacement. And in fact, those kinds of programs are addressed in the Zoned In report. So if you're looking for ideas on how to do that, look at the report.
Yeah, in fact, in our case, although we, prior to form-based code, we were not getting the development we wanted, but we were seeing those displacement pressures. We had them earlier than a lot of other places, and it's now a crisis everywhere. But 20 years ago, we were already seeing that many of those places that had provided just market rate affordable housing, because it's the area of our largest, in particular, immigrant communities. We have people from about 100 different countries. But we were seeing that places would get more valuable. The owner would clear everybody out, redo the place, put in marble countertops, and charge a lot more money. And that was where it was going to go. So we were going to this in part with the idea that we need to find a way to generate more housing that's affordable to the people who live here. Because one of our goals was, we don't want any displacement. We want the communities here to be able to be here in the decades to come.
Great, thanks. And so now we'll turn to the second major announcement that we have at the Form-Based Codes Institute. So Zoned In is, to my knowledge, the first research report that the Form-Based Codes Institute has ever taken on and produced. And we're very proud of that. But the Richard H. Driehaus Form-Based Code Award is something that the Form-Based Codes Institute, which is originally created in 2005, has been doing for just about that long. And so this is our 15th year in recognizing an exemplary adopted code. And if you look back over the years, you will see that we have recognized many different kinds of codes. And so we're really happy to acknowledge South Bend, Indiana. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter Park. Peter is one of the country's leading form-based code writers and planners. Peter has served as the director of planning for both the city of Milwaukee and the city of Denver, both cities that have adopted form-based codes. And he's worked with many, many other major cities in the country to develop and adopt form-based codes. And so, Peter, I'll turn it over to you now to introduce our other two panelists who both had a very instrumental hand in the writing and adopting of the South Bend, Indiana form-based code.
Thanks, Marta. Hi, everyone. I'm Peter Park, and I was the jury chair. I was very honored to be the chair of a really great group, and I want to, first of all, thank and acknowledge Tony Perez from Opticos and Bernice Radel, a developer, the owner of Buffalo Love Development, and she participates in the Incremental Development Alliance. Really creative, wonderful juror that worked with us. Catherine Slama from Lisa Wise Consulting, and Sam Suter from Meta Urban Design. They were a great jury. We had our work cut out for us. And ultimately, we selected what we think is really an exemplary case. I'm going to turn it over to Tim and Mike to describe what the South Bend Code is, and I'll return back and give you a little bit of comment of why the jury selected it.
Thank you, Peter. I hope everybody can hear me this afternoon. First, I'd like to thank the Form-Based Code Institute and Smart Growth America. It's a great honor to have been selected this year. We're obviously very proud of the work that we've done. We put a lot of effort into it, and I hope there are some lessons that other communities can learn from the work that we've done. I also want to make sure I acknowledge some of the other people who worked on the code. Angela Smith, who is our zoning administrator, Joe Molnar, who's with our zoning team, but also Jennifer Settle, who helped write the code, and Sean Suter of Zone Company. So these were the people that really were the core group of people that helped us put this together. So I want to acknowledge them and thank you very much. All right, so some of the context and challenges to set this up is that South Bend has suffered a population loss due to urban decline, suburbanization. Those things have affected our fiscal impacts and property tax implications, and has led to this real need to repair our neighborhoods. And we've wanted to look at these with both equity considerations, but also how do we democratize development in our community so that everybody can take part in the growth of our city. And our zoning ordinance was really hard to use, and it didn't address any of these issues. South Bend was, on the sort of the frontier of America. We like to maybe rebrand ourselves now the Silicon Prairie instead of Silicon Valley, but we had a lot of really great companies that formed the basis of our city and helped us grow. This is South Bend in 1928, very urban core, dense, built with very strong urban values. And through that, we saw population increase quite rapidly up until about 1960, 1962, when the combination of deindustrialization with the close of Studebaker and other manufacturing in South Bend, coupled with the rise of suburbanization and people fleeing the city into the suburbs, along with urban renewal, where we tore down a lot of our downtown, our historic downtown, and saw a lot of houses being demolished in some of our legacy and older neighborhoods and our original neighborhoods, really started to show this population decline. However, we've started to turn a corner, and in the last census, we gained over 2,000 new residents to the city. We're quite happy with that, and we hope we can continue that positive trend. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about today was the process in which we got to our form-based code. And the first thing that we did is we really had to define our values. And one of the things that we're showing here is it's a per acre property tax model developed by Urban 3. And it's really probably the only graphic that I could think of that to try to illustrate that urban values lead to positive tax value, but you have to look at all those positive things that come with those urban values as well. Walkability, mixed use, great neighborhoods, open space, great streets that lead to new redevelopment opportunities. So this was one of the ways that we try to view what we've been doing and the success we've been having. So one of the things that we did is we first did an internal audit of our code. We brought in external experts from Incremental Development Alliance, and we began a process called quick fixes. And that led to the final code development, which we'll show you. So one of the things that happened on my first day or first week at work here is that we were talking about a variance that somebody was requesting, where the shop on the left side wanted to reutilize that building for a mixed-use development, but it's going to require a rear buffer yard to the residential, which included a hedgerow, street trees that needed to be added, and that kicked in a new parking requirement, so they would have to buy the property next door and tear that building down. And all of these things really didn't make any sense. And so we started to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? Why are we putting people through this? Even if we might grant all the variances that would be required for that building to be used. So we brought in Incremental Development Alliance, and we started testing, stress testing our ordinance to see where things wouldn't work. And in this room, we've got planners, we've got a council member, we've got people from Incremental Development Alliance, Jennifer Settle's in there, and we all started to work really hard trying to show how we could get new development, especially missing middle development types in our city, in a city that really was developed in many ways with these types, but had been zoned out or were not legal any longer. So what we started to do is we framed our code reform at first as quick fixes. And many of these were very technical changes, or they were changing rules that we would normally give variances to. And we made these small increments. And it was almost as if there was nothing to see here, because for the most part, our local government didn't really pay attention or care that much about some of these things. They're very technical. Who cares about a site distance triangle, for instance? So we kept doing this as a way to slowly change our code, as a way also to do incremental changes, which allowed multiple times for public feedback. In fact, we had over 50 public meetings. It allowed us to test our ordinance as we went along. We built a lot of trust with our city council, so that as we made further changes, we could take those changes to get more and better urban outcomes from that. And all the while, we're working on the background document, if you will. So our quick fixes, which started to become maybe a little bit of a joke internally because it took 3 years and we were still quick fixing it. In fact, we're quick fixing our new zoning ordinance already. We do see it as a living document that as we see things change, we want to address those. But we created a zoning district for missing middle housing. We eliminated or reduced setbacks in urban areas. We eliminated off-street parking requirements. We allowed setbacks for infill construction to match existing. And we revised our subdivision regulations, limiting cul-de-sacs, maximum block lengths, and crazy, permitted new residential alleys, which had not been permitted under our former subdivision regulation. So diving into the code, I'm going to pass this over to Mike.
Thanks, Tim. So made a lot of those changes through the quick fix process, but we did want to make the ordinance easy to use and kind of across all groups as part of that democratization of kind of the revitalization of our city. So here was the old code, which wasn't that old. Actually, it was from 2004, but it's lengthy, very text heavy, didn't demonstrate the intent. And as much like Mike described in Fort Worth, kind of had this built-in suburban bias to what it was driving. So with the new code, then wanted to have a citywide, or it is a citywide zoning ordinance to capture those benefits everywhere, to really drive those urban outcomes and that value that Tim talked about, but at the same time still be able to address suburban areas in the city. So our focus was on usability and simplicity of the code. Kind of over and over again, we asked ourselves, does it really matter? So we decided to regulate what matters. So it ended up being probably a lighter form-based code than some places have, but we thought that was particularly important given the market realities here, and making development possible in areas that we hadn't seen a lot of development happening in recent decades. So it did set up, based on the Urban Transect, 8 standard zones that rise in intensity, together with 4 special zones, such as open space and industrial, to handle those special land uses. You'll see here one of the zoning districts itself. Started each zoning district with an intent image that was clear of what kind of development we hope to drive. And that followed in the series of the regulations. But instead of that text heavy that we saw before, set up in a series of tables and diagrams as much as we could. So as an example, this essentially is the same regulation, the old ordinance and the new ordinance. So you have that paragraph on the left for a standard city lot in the city. If you distill all that down, the translation would be a 15-foot setback. So in the new ordinance, we just said that. Similarly, the old zoning ordinance actually had no use table in it, but if it did, if you compiled all the uses, or 459 different uses in that code, which we thought unnecessary. So in the new ordinance, down to 66 uses, and all of those being defined. So with those changes, we were able to obviously reduce the page count from, it was 501 pages in the old ordinance, new ones at 268. So cut a full 233 pages out of our zoning ordinance. With that, beyond the document design itself, wanted to make it easy to use. So in the front end, we added kind of a how-to section that in a few pages walked a user through how to use the code. So to kind of give an overview of some of the key moves or the key pieces that were done through both the quick fix process and the new code document itself. We ordered those regulations strategically within the code, so it would follow as someone might approach a blank site. So what are the kind of things you think of first when you're laying out and designing your site, and then on into the building regulations. Then for each district, we almost think of it as a mini code. There's kind of 6 pages for each district that summarizes the key regulations. And for most kind of standard projects, even someone who's kind of a layperson to planning or development could pick that up and understand, at least at a broad scale, what the regulations are. So from the old ordinance to the new ordinance, did combine some of the zoning districts, so there's fewer, then really tried to tune it to South Bend, being able to kind of reestablish that urban atmosphere that was in many of our neighborhoods, allow for a greater mix of uses, and being sure to be responsive to changing market trends, and being able to promote investment within neighborhoods that had seen disinvestment. Did, of course, allow more housing options, introduced a zoning district that would allow anywhere from 1 to 4 units per lot, plus an ADU, so kind of that lower end of the missing middle housing spectrum that we thought then, or we've started to deploy around the city on the zoning map more aggressively. Think that would be, or I guess desired or easier to implement, and places that are a little bit hesitant about multifamily type uses. Did permit ADUs citywide, introduce some basic building type and frontage requirements that would add to the kind of beauty and walkability of the city. As Tim mentioned, eliminated the minimum off-street parking requirements, and overhauled the subdivision ordinance to add street connectivity requirements, limits on cul-de-sacs, and both number and length, and together with those block standards to make sure we're creating a walkable environment. So we'll look at some of the results here. COVID's been in effect for a little bit under 2 years. What we found, we were still doing the same amount of new development in terms of dollar value, even through the pandemic. And that was with the number of rezonings and special exceptions cut by half, and the number of variants was cut by about 2/3. And at the same time, we thought that the quality of the projects was increasing. Thought also played well to kind of the equity pieces. There was one, we saw a reuse of a couple of buildings. You saw there along Western Avenue on the city's west side. This building was rehabilitated and turned into a rental hall. Under the old ordinance, would have required a couple hundred parking spaces to go with this, so it really would have been a non-starter or go through a variance process. And this is a lower income, heavily Latino neighborhood. I can say that wouldn't have happened, or at least not happened illegally. But with the changes, this project can just proceed. Then similarly, another neighborhood that's seen population loss, but is starting to revive. Saw this reuse of an old fire station for a restaurant and apartments upstairs. Again, they didn't have to worry about parking, and a pretty easy project to do from a zoning perspective. Then we have seen greater diversity in housing types begin to come. Here, a couple of small houses built as an urban infill project just up the street from that old firehouse, and also seen ADU construction began, where it's very limited to non-existent in South Bend previously. So I'll close with some lessons learned and allow Tim to chime in as well if he wants to. But our advice would be keep that zoning ordinance simple and easy to use. Make it reflective of the city's context. I think we often think of, well, making it reflective of the context in terms of the built environment of what it's looked like in the past. But also, we would say keep in mind that the political and economic realities of your community. That's, I guess, the only way that the code is ultimately going to be successful. And we say to practice that incremental code reform, the quick fixes that we use before doing the complete overhaul. That'll give you some indication of the level of support for the zoning reform in your community. And then assemble a strong code writing team with the right members. Ours had great consultants, but also very staff driven, where we combined some of our kind of longer range planning staff who good from a policy strategy perspective, with our zoning team who's working on the day-to-day and has a good sense of the practical implications of what these rules are. Then our lead consultant was good background in urban design, or comes at it from an urban design mindset, which was very helpful. And then I used a lawyer as well, make sure everything's on the up and up, but help us through the process to make reuse of existing buildings easy. I think that wraps up ours, unless you had any comments to add there, Tim. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, I think, yeah, that's it. Happy to answer any questions.
Well, I just wanted to chime in a little bit. Thanks, guys, for great work and for submitting your work. We were very pleased to award your submission. You know, the form-based code, the Treehouse Award, each year, it's becoming a bit more challenging to identify these points of distinction in the practice form-based codes, and that's good news, right, Chris? I mean, we've come a long way, we're getting better at it, and every year we're seeing better and better codes. And the South Bend code is no exception. And one of the things that stood out for us as a jury is, well, I will put it in two major categories. One, you legalize the urban form, right? Especially in cities where, right, what we often are encountering is not only the sort of the suburban bias that's built into the code, right? But it just is ignoring the existing city. And in the case of South Bend, you've got a great city. It was just hard to follow the code and get an outcome that looked like it would fit with the existing city. So you guys did a great job in understanding the context and deriving and calibrating the standards based on existing patterns, right? And we particularly liked your very practical perspective of just regulate what you need to, just regulate the basics. And quite frankly, that's the way all codes should work. So we really applaud you on that. And there are all kinds of aspects. I mean, you all can look at South Bend's code to understand all the ways that they just legalize the urban form, reducing parking, getting rid of parking in urban places, and removing unnecessary setbacks, right? And a whole number of things that just made it easier to build better buildings. And the second aspect of it, I guess I'd put it in the category as just making it easier to do the right thing, right? And I think that's fundamentally what codes ought to do, right? That it shouldn't be that difficult. And in the case of South Bend, a great example, when I was a planning director in Milwaukee, when we redid the code, I mean, part of it is, right, we're trying to get investment to the city in areas that were significantly disinvested. The last thing in the world that should be a barrier to investment in a city and a neighborhood would be the codes that are supposed to be guiding that development, right? So in this code, as our participants, as you guys look through this as an example, you'll see some really great approaches that they came up with. We particularly liked also the sort of the mini code approach. I mean, fundamentally, if you have zoning, if you write the code for people who are shop zoning districts, right, that's within a system of a broken zoning system, right? Because only way I can get development is I have to do a rezoning. So you organize the code to make it easier for people to shop the code. The reality is, right, you guys have done the right thing, which is there's one zone district that applies to my property. Make it simple for me to understand what applies to me. And we found that the organization of the code in that way, the graphics are really beautiful, really elegant, and easy to read. And even then, you provided a great user's guide. So we think that there are a lot of great things that this code has to offer. One of the things I think that is the most significant is that you get so much of it in-house, right? You guys are the experts, alongside with the folks who are at the counter, working with customers. And you know, what we took away and understood is, right, everyone's role in terms of the consultant, in terms of the staff, was organized in a very productive way, such that as you mentioned it, you were able to build trust. And ultimately, when we're talking about people's property rights, that's a pretty important thing, right? As we all know. But you were able to build trust through that incremental, the quick fixes, right? And it was your faces, it was your engagement and ownership of the code that, in fact, our jury believes, in fact, is what will make it most sustainable, right? Because you have a great sense of ownership. You have a lot of understanding of where to adjust it, how to adjust it if it's necessary. And we think that the process that you went through of making the code was really one that many cities, many communities can learn from. So really great work.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to all of you. We have about 10 minutes, a little less, for questions. Let's start with the chat. And Jamie, are you seeing some questions coming through on the chat?
Certainly, and thank you everyone for submitting so many great questions, and apologies for not being able to answer all of them. One common theme we've been getting is how you defend a form-based code amongst those who refuse to accept it. You know, and specifically, can you speak to at the community level? For example, in a town that's very auto-dependent, how would you convince them to eliminate off-street parking requirements? But also at a governmental level, for a community that's planning 30 years in advance, how do you approach a resistant governmental department to plan for the future?
Wow. So I think that's a great question. I think we're sort of lucky in one regard in that our departments are pretty well aligned, and I think that is in part due to great leadership from our previous mayor and our current mayor, to make sure that they understand that we're all working towards a common goal here. The eliminating parking requirements, it is, I know some places they find it so impossible to do, but it is really a no-brainer. The way we approached it was, we're trying to make things easier for people to do, but we're also trying to say, hey, let's take a market-driven approach to this. So if a developer wants to add the parking, that's great. We have some standards for that. But if they don't want to provide it or provide it at a lower level, we're completely happy with that as well. And so I think there are some people that like that idea that it's a market-driven approach. So that's one of the best. We also showed through aerial imagery that our parking lots were not being utilized at the rate that we had required in the past. And also that the parking standards, it's almost like a dark art to try to figure out like how many parking spaces per barber chair, or I think one of the most ridiculous ones was number of parking spaces for how much water was in a swimming pool at a public pool. I mean, it's crazy. Like, so if you can't figure it out and no one can understand like how a rule came to be, well then you should get rid of it. And that's what we did. We sat around the table between Michael, Angela, Jennifer, and if we couldn't figure it out, we just got rid of it.
I would also say that to focus on the outcomes, we didn't go and shop it around and say, look, it's a form-based code, or look, it's based on the transect, or any of those. Said, hey, we want to make development easier where people can pick it up and understand. Easier for neighborhoods that hadn't seen development in decades, and there's things like the parking standards that were holding them back, and say, hey, from a practical standpoint, we're not abolishing parking, we're just not mandating that you build a certain number. And I think those kind of messages, particularly in our kind of legacy city type environment, really resonated.
Anyone else additional thoughts about communications, Mike?
Well,
Brennan?
just on the parking front, one really critical outcome from eliminating those off-street parking requirements is the incentive for adaptive reuse of historic buildings. And I think that Michael mentioned that when he was showing the event center. We've seen that over and over. And so if within your community, if that's one of your goals, not only to attract new construction, but to bring these older buildings back to life, eliminating that parking requirement, that is absolutely essential. And those are typically the areas where people have been getting by without having a big parking lot immediately adjacent to where they're going. And so that's something to emphasize. We are just now, 13 years in, we're just now seeing some pioneering projects that actually don't provide parking. And so the reality for new construction is that you know, the 90% of the developers are going to provide the parking that they would anyway in any zoning classification. That's the reality. It really benefits the historic buildings.
Yeah, I'd say, Martin, in our
You know,
case,
Martha, I just like to, oh, go ahead. Chris, go ahead.
I was going to say briefly, we did totally eliminate parking, which wasn't a, kind of vibe. If I said that, we got nowhere. But what we did was basically relax the requirements enough so that the kind of building, including one of the ones I showed you there, could be built without actually having to solve its own parking problem. So we made it so that every parcel doesn't have to solve its own parking problem. And we created a way to generate a parking pool, which then would serve. So we could say, there's parking, it's across the street under this building over here or something like that. So if you can go all the way, okay, great. But there are ways in between to like not, scare everybody that there's going to be no place to park, but also not have it hold up the kind of buildings you're talking about.
Good point. Peter?
Yeah. I was just going to say to the first question about this, I mean, I recognize we are the Form-Based Code Institute, but in practice now, one of the great advantages of form-based code technique is our reliance on graphics a lot, right? So we don't actually like to say we're doing a form-based code if that's going to be a trigger for somebody. In fact, don't even say it. But in the way you engaged with community, as these guys did, I'd engage with a lot of images and illustrations and get to the meat of the matter rather than it being a form-based code that somebody's going to oppose this thing that sounds unfamiliar.
Right.
Just appeal to people.
It shouldn't be controversial that you've chosen to do a form-based code. It's just the way it's presented in many ways. So I think when people, pick up the old document, which was heavy, and we did an illustration where we would drop the binder on the table, and be like, how, this is how massive it was. But and then for them to see the complete change between one and the other, it really, a lot of people were very surprised at what came out of it. So I think that part of it was the easy part for us.
Yeah. So, well, we're just about at time now. I'm sure there are a lot of other good questions. I want to thank all of our presenters. Chris Zimmerman, who is Vice President for Economic Development at Smart Growth America. Mike Brennan, President of Near Southside Inc. Thank you very much, both of you, for your conversations, for your discussion about the case studies in Zoned In. And Mike DeVita, Principal Planner in South Bend, Indiana, and Tim Corcoran, who's Director of Planning and Community Resources. Thank you both for presenting the award winner, the Driehaus Award winner for this year. And Peter, thank you for leading the jury and for your comments today. I also want to mention that I believe all of these codes, I know now South Bend and Columbia Pike are in the Form-Based Codes Institute Library of Codes, which is a library it's searchable on categories, types of codes, types of communities on the Form-Based Code Institute website, where there's a lot of other good resources as well. And the Driehaus, all of the Driehaus Award winners, as well as some other codes that have been adopted and reviewed, are there. So if you're looking for more good ideas about form-based codes, please look there. Jamie, thank you for organizing this. And I think we'll say goodbye and thanks to everybody who attended. Take care. Bye-bye.